begin now, and we welcome also one more participant, that is Gerald Green, and maybe there is somebody else as well. Greetings to all of you. What I wanted to say essentially is that how countries manage with bilateral summits is really a dimension of the larger issue of how countries can use techniques and methods to better manage their linkages with countries. That's part of a larger theme that is of interest to me, which is how to manage bilateral relationships. Are there good practices that can be applied to this? Are there techniques that one can learn from the experience of other countries? And maybe as we go along, we'll talk about this in a little more detail. But coming to summit meetings, what I want to say is that travel by leaders has expanded enormously. That's obvious in every country, in every region. Leaders have to go for major global meetings, for regional meetings, and in the process, they also carry out bilateral exchanges. But in addition to that, the classic bilateral meeting, the summit, where one leader visits another country for a day, 2 days, or sometimes longer, and engages in comprehensive discussion, that remains a tool that all countries use, some more, some a little less. And when they travel, they take with them businessmen as well as public figures. Educationists, for example, are taken. Scientists travel with leaders. Other figures from public life, parliamentarians, heads of NGOs, and other personalities who have a kind of international presence. And in all this, countries are very much interested in using visits also to reach out to publics. And we'll come to that in a moment. I think this is a matter of craft skill. So, a summit meeting between leaders is a public event. It was always a public event in the remote past when very few encounters like that took place. And then we were perhaps in a kind of middle phase when capitals would be inundated with leaders, and the local media sometimes would not pay very much attention to a visiting leader. And now we come back to a situation where some countries stage events which will give them higher visibility and higher profile. And I'll give some examples. But first, let's ask the question, how useful are these visits? What do you achieve through them? Well, one element is that leaders are in their own right key foreign policy actors, because in every country, the head of government is really the principal personality in foreign policy affairs. He has a foreign minister usually, there is a foreign ministry, but they play a role that is tightly intertwined with the work of the leader, the head of government, and his staff. So it is logical, therefore, that when leaders travel, this becomes an occasion for a comprehensive analysis of a relationship with the country that is visited. Of course, publics are cynical. Sometimes they ask, are these summits so useful? Are they not a waste of money, special aircraft, large delegations, banquets, and all the paraphernalia? But actually, the cost of summit travel is not all that large when you consider the potential gain. The fact remains that some summits are more productive than others. So What are the success elements? How can summits be used in the most productive manner possible? And I have tried to identify four basic stages, if you want to call it that, in executing a leader travel program or a summit meeting. First, the why. Why go to a particular country? Which country do you choose? What are your objectives in that country? These questions do need to be addressed. In the real world, leaders don't always pay tight attention to the why. Sometimes um, there may be an idiosyncratic reason. A leader wishes to go to a particular place or a country for sentimental reason or personal preference. And this element of personal wishes of the leader is a factor in the real world that comes up from time to time. So let's assume that a decision has been taken to make a visit to a particular country. How do we execute that? That's the how of it. Uh, One way is to look at all the dossiers in play. What are the issues that are left over from a previous summit encounter? What are the current subjects which are under discussion between the two countries? There may be agreements, there may be disagreements, there may be issues that one has taken up, there may be economic or political subjects that are ripe for discussion. All these have to be examined, and one has to perhaps set a kind of target as to what one wants to achieve from that summit encounter. Then we come to the third stage, the planning stage, or the what, where you look at the choice of the delegation, who will accompany, how many businessmen are to be taken, will it be a large business delegation or a small, carefully selected delegation? What will be the program? Will the leader want to talk to young people at a university or speak to the parliament? Would receiving an honorary degree from a university be a good idea? And how to generate public impact. I'll give you the example of two visits that took place to India in February by the French president, who was followed 10 days, 12 days later by the British Prime Minister. In the case of the British Prime Minister, clearly a lot of careful planning had taken place. Before coming to Delhi, he visited Mumbai and he visited one of the major information technology companies there, one of the largest software company in India, in fact, called TCS. And there he used the atrium of the main building of this company to speak to several hundred young software engineers. And it did for visual impact, because there he was at the floor of the atrium, surrounded by lots of young people who also crowded on the higher floors, which looked down on the atrium. So in a sense, this became a kind of town hall meeting, if you want to call it that, except that it was a foreign leader meeting them. And when British Prime Minister Cameron came to Delhi, apart from all the usual things, he went to a college and again met with a bunch of students. But the novel element was that he took with him an actor who is currently engaged in a very effective public program of outreach, which is called Satyamev Jayate, which is the motto, the national motto of India, let truth triumph. That program brings up major societal issues in India and connects with quite literally a few 100 million people who watch the program every Sunday morning. So by taking Amir Khan with him, Cameron made sure that he would have a major impact, because young students came to see Amir Khan, not so much the British Prime Minister. But he didn't care. As far as he was concerned, he had an opportunity to talk to young people, and through them, through the live TV broadcasts reach out to a major national audience. Now, compared with that, the French president's program was orthodox. It followed all the usual kind of things, fairly boring and not of much interest to the uh, electronic media in particular, or even the print media. And I said to myself, in fact, I wrote an article about it, how a savvy bunch of diplomats could use a bilateral visit for effective public outreach. So that's one example. And finally, there is the fourth stage of the summit where one decides what is to come out of the visit. What have been the achievements which have to be communicated to all the stakeholders? How do you follow up on the decisions of the visit? And that is the element of implementation. And all too often, I served on the staff of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi a long time back, and since then, I've also noticed that summit meetings quite often are not followed up. The decisions taken just linger on, and many people simply forget as to what was decided at the summit meeting. So these to me are the four key elements of tight management of bilateral summits. So let me come to my next slide, which is how do you go about an effective foreign policy program that utilizes summit meetings? Well, one method is to do something that Thailand did some 7-8 years ago, in the days, in fact, when Thaksin Shinawatra was the Prime Minister, and he brought a lot of management ideas into foreign policy. Thailand established a list of priority countries, some 30 of them, and made a forward plan looking to the next 5 years, trying to identify the things they wish to do with that country, whether it was signing a free trade agreement, taking investments to a certain level, taking trade to a certain level, tourism exchanges, education exchanges of students, and all these different specific activities which mesh into a good relationship. Canada does something similar. It also establishes a list of priority countries. Each year it's a rotating list. Not too many countries actually use this method, and I wonder why not. Another method is serial summits, where a leader has an encounter, say in the year 2014, and then says, or the two leaders agree, that they'll meet again in 12 months or 18 months' time, and when they meet again, they will pursue the decisions that were taken when they met in 2014, and they will then try and establish new milestones for what they want to achieve. I saw this effectively implemented between India and Germany when I served in Bonn many years back. That's a good method. Another related issue or a technique is to establish an action agenda. To say, when we meet the next time, these are the issues on which we wish to see results. So it gives the administration of the two countries, meaning not just the foreign ministry, but the other ministries as well, the governments as a whole, to pursue identified issues and bring them to a successful conclusion. What this means then is the summit is not treated as a singular event, as a meteor or a comet that passes by, but it is treated as part of a process. And this really is the key issue. And I would conclude with a few last points that the bilateral diplomatic process is something that can be a subject of methodical monitoring and execution of activities. Of course, this means that in each country, the foreign ministry has to partner all the different ministries, state institutions, non-state actors who have a contribution to make to that relationship. One example is universities or science and technology, to identify the institutions that should establish activities that will be mutually beneficial. Identify areas of scientific research in which the two countries have a shared interest, and get the scientific community and the academics to set their own goals, set their own targets on what they will achieve. The other method is, I already talked about the Thai technique of establishing a 5-year goal. And in all these methods, what is essential, of course, is for the foreign ministry to play a lead role, to act as a coordinator, but to work with a whole series of home actors, state and non-state, and to be amenable to supervision by the office of the head of government. This is really the essence of what I wanted to say, and I am now open to discussion with you on the basis of your views and your comments, which would come to me, I think, in the shape of your typed comments. But if there is a way in which a microphone can be passed to you, I'd be delighted to do that also. But I suppose it may not be easy now that we have 11 participants in the webinar. So the floor is yours. Please give me your thoughts, your suggestions, and I am sure I have much to learn from your experiences. Okay, I have a question from Gerald Green, who says, could you comment a bit more on the experience of dealing with stakeholders and preparing for the summit? Sure. Dealing with stakeholders is, what shall I say, an activity to which there is no finality. That is to say, the more one engages, the more one reaches out to stakeholders, the more one realizes that they can play a major role. It's really, I mean, for foreign ministries, it is a little bit like opening up the process and accepting others as legitimate partners in the process. I can give you examples, but I'm perhaps not so good. You know, Ginger, it has always included public diplomacy resources. The difference is that now there are many more of them, many more are active in it, and we all seem to now understand that the more you bring in other participants, the better it will be. One simple example is business delegations. Very few business delegations. Sorry, my audio is lost. I'm sorry about that. Let me try again. Again, it seems to go off. Can you hear me again? Okay, okay. Angelic has a question. She asked whether, resistance from other ministries, that do other ministries, will they take part in, they may resent a little bit. These are not your words, these are my words perhaps, that they may resent this kind of leadership by the foreign ministry. I think, Angelic, the solution is a fairly straightforward one. If the head of government is the agency that is directing the process, then I think it becomes easier for other ministries to join in and to understand that they have to work with the head of government and with the staff of the head of government. The office of the head of government has a crucial coordinating role in such matters. I see another comment. Ginger says, is bilateral diplomacy beginning to address internet governance and internet management issues? Ginger, my impression is that in most countries, internet governance is still very much a technical question, which does not attract too much attention from the public. Forget about the government. In the media, for example, here in India, I see occasionally a discussion organized by a think tank on internet governance issues. But I rarely see an article that analyzes the hard issues or what is at play on this. Internet governance issues did come up when we had a US visitor here a few weeks back. But I don't think it drew a great amount of public comment. Anna, this also responds to a question that you perhaps had. Okay, there is a question from Tanya where she says, what is the best way to integrate civil society in bilateral summits, respecting representativity without losing efficiency? Well, again, it depends on the system in the country. For example, some European leaders, when they travel abroad, they take with them members of what you would call civil society in a broad sense, parliamentarians, heads of churches or religious leaders, heads of NGOs, and other public figures. Here in India, we don't often take NGO leaders on bilateral summits, but certainly members of parliament travel, as do businessmen, university vice chancellors, scientists, and of course media representatives. So all this really becomes part of an opening up of the process. I don't think we are in a perfect situation, but I think we are now in a framework where foreign ministries, leaders who go abroad, realize that it is useful to take with them people who have a wider range of interests. Now, having said that, I should add one other key point, which is when you take these different groups or these different segments of society, it is also important to include them in the program. That is to tailor-make a program that caters to the competencies of the different groups. Businessmen obviously want to connect with other businessmen. Civil society leaders similarly wish to connect with other civil society leaders. So what I'm trying to say is that the bilateral summit then becomes a kind of activity on multiple fronts. That is why the leaders are engaged in their conversations, their necessarily private and confidential exchanges. The other segments have their own programs, and they all come together in the evening, for example, at a reception or at a banquet where much wider, across the board conversations and exchanges take place. So, managing this kind of a summit, I will tell you, as somebody who has worked on this from the inside, is a complex process. It's a demanding process, and it involves reaching out in the receiving country to a similar group of actors, state and non-state. And this becomes a management issue as well. Some more questions. Multi-stakeholder model in negotiation. Yes and no. It all depends on the kind of negotiation. If you are negotiating, say, a free trade agreement, necessarily you will have included your domestic stakeholders in preparing your position. So, non-state actors will have made their contribution there. The heads of think tanks, the NGOs, the academic institutions, etc. In the actual negotiations, would they take part? Not typically, but there are regional summit meetings or global summit meetings, say at the WTO, where you do have leaders of civil society organizations that take part. Gerald Green has a question. Time is limited. You're absolutely right, Gerald. And that is why managing a summit is really a complex activity. I mean, during those 48 hours or 72 hours which may be available, you really have to plan each event on a minute-to-minute basis, quite literally. And I have a little bit of experience on this in Germany, and I plan to write about it in a memoir on which I'm working right now. Ahmed has a question. He asks, is it advisable to include all stakeholders in the negotiation process, and why would that hinder talks? Clearly, that is difficult to do. One cannot really have stakeholders, non-state actors involved in state-to-state negotiations. You give the example of the Syrian negotiations. Now, the Syrian negotiations, of course, or the Syria issue negotiations are an enormously complicated matter in which necessarily non-state actors are also in some ways principals. I would not include that under the rubric of bilateral summits as such. That's a very, very special kind of situation, if I may say. Tanya asks how to generate media interest and public opinion. That was just the point I tried to address, Tanya, when I gave the example of the British Prime Minister's visit to New Delhi, in contrast to the visit that had been made by the French President 10 days earlier. And that was in February this year, in fact. It's a very recent event. The media is interested today if they feel that their coverage will attract eyeballs, that is, for the TV media or for the radio. But let's just think of TV for a moment. So, TV must have visuals. We must offer something to TV that will be interesting and exciting. And some countries understand it and some countries don't. And it's as simple as that. I mean, if there is an event in which the leaders are seen to be engaged in front of a live audience, for example, that is of interest to TV. But if it's a question of a leader reading out from a text, boredom sets in very, very quickly. And I have to say, even today, there are major leaders who go to bilateral summit meetings and take with them a bunch of papers and they proceed to read from a text. Truthfully speaking, even the audience that is listening to a leader who speaks from a prepared text will lose attention. And the electronic media very seldom have interest in this unless it's a major, major event in which issues of global importance are at play. But otherwise, in a typical bilateral summit, forget it. They have zero interest in that. Angelic has a question. The stronger a society is organized, the different sectors, the better they will be able to involve stakeholders in a representative way. Absolutely right. And this is why it is important to have in one's country a wide array of non-state actors. Let me just take the example of think tanks. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they have deliberately carried out a policy over the last 35, 40 years of encouraging and assisting in the development of think tanks that deal with foreign policy and strategic issues. I think this is a very clever way of nurturing a range of new civil society actors in your country. You remember, ASEAN began with 5 members, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Then Brunei joined. And those 6 were joined, was it in the early 90s, by the 4 countries of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Now, these 4 countries, some of them at least, did not have very much by way of think tanks. And a deliberate effort was made to foster, to implant and inculcate genuine domestic think tanks, not branches of some foreign entity. I have nothing against branches of NGOs, but they are, to me, not as authentic as NGOs or think tanks which are homegrown. And that is what has happened now. In each of these countries, there is a mushrooming growth of new academic think tanks. You have similar growth taking place in the NGO world, where again, I would vote in favor of NGOs that are homegrown rather than NGOs that are the of international agency. But that's a matter of opinion, and you're welcome to disagree with me. But from a government's point of view, it is useful to engage with a range of civil society actors, including those that really belong to the country. There is a comment from Graham. He says, agreements are signed during summit and follow-up is a responsibility. How does one guard against everyone rushing to sign something? There must be a filtering of agreements to be signed. Graham, you're absolutely right. Quite often what happens is there is a kind of standard thinking that comes into play. People in foreign ministries and embassies sometimes think that the more agreements that are signed during a particular summit, the more impressive that event will be. Now, of course, that's not the reality. The reality is that the summit is impressive or not impressive by virtue of many attributes. The number of agreements signed has very little real impact on the significance or the importance of the summit. And so that leads to a kind of inflation of agreements and protocols which are really signed without any serious intent of implementation. And I think an agreement that is signed under those conditions is really not going to be productive at all. This is a serious problem. Michael has a question about the team of negotiators apart from the foreign ministry who leads, how it is formed. I would refer you, Michael, to an 8-point formula on negotiation that was developed by Tommy Coe, who is a legendary diplomatic wizard in Singapore. And one of the things that Tommy Coe addressed of the negotiation. Plan carefully and see the implications of negotiation. Make sure they work well before the negotiation. But to really understand the perspective of impact and then as you're absolutely right. Negotiation teams is not the private property of the foreign ministry in any way. Sorry, again there is an audio problem. Sorry, I'm sorry about this. Arvind, is there anything I can do to improve matters? You have audio now. Okay, I've now figured out where is the audio control. If it goes off again, I'll be able to spot it on my own. Thank you very much. Pardon my inexperience with webinars and the webinar technique. I promise the next time I will be a little bit smarter in how I use this. Okay, I think I've responded. My apologies. I ignored a question from Jose. I am truly sorry about this. Jose, let me go back, or even better, please repeat your question, because it must be that in the flow of the conversation I overlooked a point you made. I'm looking for Jose's question. I still don't find it. I'm sorry. Jose, can you please repeat your question? If because I'm really not able to find it here on the panel of questions that have been put to me. I'm searching again, trying to go back as much as I can. Jose, can you please repeat your question? My apologies, but I have not been able to find your question. While we are doing that, in order to save time, Arvind, can we have on the panel the first of our simple polls? We wanted to do a poll. Yes, I think the poll question is in front of you now. And you are welcome, please, to respond to the poll question. at your convenience. There are only 2 poll questions, and I think for each one, maybe 2 minutes are allowed. Oh no, 5 minutes are allowed. So 25 seconds, 27 seconds have passed. Okay. Glenda has a question. Follow-up meetings. Yes, Glenda. In any follow-up meeting, one has to include all the actors. One has to make that process as transparent and inclusive as possible. Because supposing one belongs to the Ministry of Transport, which also deals with civil aviation, if they are not included in a discussion on the air flights or the air contacts between countries, obviously they will have no ownership over any decision you take. So you have to bring them into the process right from the beginning. And this is really the central task of a foreign ministry in my view, which is how to reach out to all the domestic state actors and non-state actors, bring them into the planning process of the summit meeting or the planning process of managing that bilateral relationship with a neighboring country, with a great power, or with anyone else. And then, as you move along, as the discussion unfolds with the foreign partner, to keep them in the picture, to go back to them with questions, and thereby ensure that whatever is the outcome will be their shared outcome. That is, they will feel a sense of participation in the process, and they will also feel responsible about implementing what has been agreed. It sounds idealistic, but it is done. It can be done. If it is not done, then there is no follow-up. I can give you Indian examples of summits that have not been followed up, summit decisions that have remained unattended, not because anybody was out to sabotage them, simply nobody got around to taking the collective actions that were required. But I will not give you these examples because I'm pretty sure the same kind of examples are available in almost every country around the world. Yes, some handle things better than others, but nowhere can we say we have achieved a degree of perfection in managing these kind of relationships. And when it's not done, then what happens is each round of discussion that takes place over the years becomes repetitive, and the two sides, in a sense, lose interest in the process. We have, with some neighboring countries, issues, projects, hydropower projects, major projects which would bring enormous value to the countries concerned, which have been discussed and discussed for 30 years and 40 years, but with no action. And then what happens is that the process loses credibility. Each side, or maybe both sides, turns around and says, hey, this is a waste of time. We are just singing the same song repeatedly and nothing happens. Okay, I have a comment from Tanya, who says audio or video conferences will replace face-to-face bilaterals. Tanya, I really wonder. I don't think the audio or video conferences will replace face-to-face meetings between leaders, but they will enormously supplement those kind of meetings. For example, once a decision is taken, one can easily follow up on a decision with the kind of meetings that you have in mind, audio or video. In fact, video conferencing is a fine way of engaging the other side and alerting them that we have an interest in this or that issue, and listening to the other side in terms of their priorities and their interests. So I think that should work beautifully. Why will video conferencing not completely replace bilateral summits? Well, I think it will not, because it is when you look into the eyes of the other person, you have all the non-verbal signals, all the communication that takes place even in silence between people who are trying to reach out to one another. It is only through this kind of intrapersonal interaction that mutual confidence is usually established. And there are no guarantees. Not every summit is guaranteed to succeed, but the ones that work seem to work on the basis of face-to-face meetings. Okay, so we have the responses to our first little questionnaire, the poll, and we now have. Can we have on the screen the second poll, please? And we can reduce the time. The poll has ended. Can we reduce the time for the second poll to maybe 2 minutes? Is that possible? We really don't need so much time, and I'm sure people are busy and have got lots of other things to attend to. So, okay, the time limit given is still 5 minutes, but Arvind, if you can adjust it to maybe 2 or 3 minutes, that would be ideal. Angelic has a comment. Angelic also agrees that face-to-face contact cannot be replaced with the video conferencing. Gerald, the cost of summits. Yes, Gerald, I still feel that bilateral summits are indispensable. But, as you rightly observe, for small countries, they impose a cost. They impose a cost in time, they impose a financial cost, hiring of aircraft, etc. Let me give you an example. The Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Abe, in the first 12 months of his taking office, he made bilateral visits to all the 10 ASEAN countries. Now, Japan is a major power. Mr. Abe has a huge domestic parliamentary public agenda to deal with, but he created time in order to make those visits to the 10 capitals of ASEAN countries, because he wanted to show to them that his country is back as a major player in international affairs. And I think that is how it works. Sometimes time has to be created. Equally, it's possible to find time on the margins of a global summit or a regional summit. And that is where a great deal of discussion actually takes place. Okay, yes, you have a question. Debate on the value of summits. Usually they get a little more attention when a new government takes office and expectations are high. But once the leaders are met a couple of times, their interest seems to diminish. Well, what you're really saying is that there is a kind of summit fatigue. Gerald also puts the same question, a kind of summit fatigue. Well, Jose, it depends on the value you derive from the summit. I'll give you an actual example. The Prime Minister of India and the German Chancellor started a practice of near annual meetings between these two leaders way back in 1991. And before that, they hardly met once in 3-4 years. But they found that those first couple of summit meetings that took place in 91, 93, and 94 produced so much of concrete result. They found it worthwhile to decide, and in the case of Germany, this was put in black and white in a public document, that they identified China, Japan, and India as their three strategic partners with whom leaders would hold meetings annually. And they more or less stuck to that format. So here are two countries that found it useful to do so, useful to meet. Similarly, South Africa, leaders of South Africa and their neighboring countries meet at least once a year, usually 2 or 3 times a year. Again, these are serial summits that take place because they feel they produce value. So it all depends on what one gets out of the summit.